It looks like a giant cable spool discarded on a wet beach, 10 feet of steel skeleton standing alone in the sand. To a casual observer, it might resemble a piece of their heavy agricultural machinery, or perhaps a wheel from a giant's wagon. But look closer at the rim. Bolted to the steel are dozens of cylinders, not spokes but rockets. This is not a farm tool, it is a 10-ton rolling bomb designed to breach the strongest wall in history. This is the Great Panjandrum. The year is 1943. The tactical reality of the European theatre has shifted from defence to the necessity of invasion. The defining obstacle for the Allied forces is the Atlantic Wall. This is not a single structure, but a contiguous system of coastal fortifications stretching from the French-Spanish border to the northern tip of Norway. The specific engineering problem facing the British Admiralty is the reinforced concrete of the German defences. The organisation TOD, the civil and military engineering group responsible for the wall, has poured millions of tons of concrete. A standard bunker wall is 2 meters thick. The larger casemates protecting heavy coastal artillery can be up to 3.5 meters of steel-reinforced concrete. Conventional methods of breaching these defences are deemed insufficient. Aerial bombardment is notoriously inaccurate. A near miss does nothing to a structure designed to withstand direct hits from naval artillery. Naval bombardment, while powerful, has a flat trajectory that often skips off the sloped glacis plates of the bunkers. The disaster at Dieppe in August 1942 provided a grim dataset. Canadian tanks stalled on the shingle. Infantry were pinned down by enfilading fire from bunkers that remained operational despite preparatory shelling. The conclusion drawn by the chiefs of staff is that the wall must be breached at ground level. A hole must be punched through the concrete large enough for a tank to drive through. This requirement lands on the desk of the Directorate of Miscellaneous Weapon Development, the DMWD. Based at the Admiralty but operating with a high degree of autonomy, the DMWD is a collection of scientists, engineers and naval officers tasked with solving problems that traditional departments have failed to address. They are the Department of Wheezers and Dodgers. The specific project falls to Neville Shute, Norway. He is an aeronautical engineer by trade. Formerly the Deputy Chief Engineer at Vickers Armstrong, where he worked on the R-100 airship. He is also a Lieutenant Commander in the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve. He is joined by Captain Edward Goodeve, a Canadian physicist and chemist who serves as the Assistant Director of the DMWD. Their brief is specific. Deliver 1 ton of high explosives to the base of a concrete wall. Do it without exposing a tank crew to direct anti-tank fire. The initial calculations rule out a remote-controlled tank. The terrain of the beaches, soft sand, shingle, anti-tank obstacles like Rommel's asparagus and Czech hedgehogs, makes a tracked vehicle slow and vulnerable. If it is hit before it reaches the wall, the explosion is wasted. Shute proposes a different approach. He looks to the concept of the rolling charge. If the explosive load itself is the wheel, the weight becomes an asset rather than a liability. Momentum can carry it through obstacles that would stop a tank. The design begins to take shape on the drafting tables at the Admiralty. It is designated the Panjandrum. The name is drawn from an 18th century piece of nonsense verse by Samuel Foote, specifically the line, "And there were present the Piccaninnies and the Joblilies and the Garrules and the Grand Panjandrum himself, with the little round button at top." The device is essentially 2 giant wheels connected by a central drum. The central drum is the payload. It is designed to hold 4,000 pounds, 1,800 kilograms of TNT. The drum is roughly the width of a standard tank, allowing the breach it creates to be immediately usable by armour. The wheels are massive. They are 10 feet 3 meters in diameter. They are constructed of steel. The reasoning for the diameter is twofold. First, a large diameter wheel rolls more easily over soft sand and irregular shingle than a small wheel. Second, the sheer height of the device allows the central explosive drum to clear smaller obstacles like barbed wire entanglements and low concrete barriers. Propulsion is the critical engineering hurdle. An internal combustion engine is too heavy and complex. It requires transmission, gears, and fuel lines, all of which are vulnerable to enemy fire. Shute opts for solid fuel rockets. The rockets selected are standard 5-inch cordite rockets. These are off-the-shelf components originally designed for anti-aircraft barrages and later adapted for air-to-ground attacks by Hawker Typhoons. Each rocket is roughly 3 feet long. They contain a stick of cordite propellant. When ignited, they burn fiercely for a very short duration. The design calls for these rockets to be mounted on the perimeter of the 10-foot wheels. They are set in steel brackets welded directly to the rim. The configuration is critical. They are arranged tangentially to the circumference. When fired, the thrust of the rocket pushes against the bracket, imparting rotational force to the wheel. It is a simple equation of torque, force times radius. With a 5-foot radius, the rockets have significant leverage. The estimated weight of the fully loaded Panjandrum is 10 tons. To move 10 tons from the shoreline to the Atlantic Wall at a speed sufficient to prevent interception requires immense thrust. Chute calculates that a single set of rockets will not provide enough sustained power to cross the distance of a standard beach. The solution is a sequential firing system. The rims of the wheels are fitted with clusters of rockets. The initial design calls for roughly 70 rockets in total. They are not all ignited at once. The ignition system is a complex web of electrical wiring and centrifugal switches. A specific number of rockets are wired to ignite at launch. As the wheel gathers speed and the first set of rockets burns out, the heat or a centrifugal trigger ignites the second stage. This is intended to provide a continuous acceleration curve, pushing the device up the beach and into the target. Construction of the prototype begins in strict secrecy at the sweet-smelling factory of the WD&HO, Wills Tobacco Company in Bristol. It is not a standard engineering facility, but the DMWD often utilised civilian manufacturing capacity that was underutilised due to wartime shortages. The prototype is not filled with high explosives. The central drum is filled with sand to simulate the weight of the TNT. The focus of the initial phase is purely hydrodynamic and aerodynamic. Will the thing roll? The testing ground is selected carefully. It needs to be a flat, firm, sandy beach with a gradient similar to the beaches of Normandy. It needs to be relatively secluded to maintain security. The choice is Westward Ho in North Devon. The exclamation mark is part of the town's legal name, derived from the Charles Kingsley novel. It is September 1943. The beach at Westward Ho is cleared of civilians. The area is designated a restricted military zone. The DMWD team arrives, accompanied by a small contingent of technicians and a film crew, to document the trials for the Admiralty. The prototype Panjandrum is unloaded. It is an imposing structure, 10 feet high, steel wheels rimmed with rockets, a central drum packed with 4 tons of sand. It sits on the wet sand at the low tide mark. Test run number 1, September 7th, 1943. The objective of the first test is low-velocity motion. The team does not load the full complement of rockets. They install a limited number, just enough to get the 10-ton mass moving. Naval Chute observes from a safe distance behind a dune. The firing circuit is closed. A cloud of white smoke erupts from the rim of the wheels. The cordite catches, the rockets scream, the massive steel structure lurches forward. It begins to roll. The initial rotation is slow. The sand provides significant resistance. But as the thrust builds, the speed increases. The Panjandrum moves up the beach. It covers a short distance. Then the friction of the sand intervenes. The rockets burn out. The device slows and comes to a halt. It has moved. It has not tipped over. It has not exploded. Technically, this is a success. However, the distance covered is negligible compared to the operational requirements. The friction coefficients of the wet sand are higher than calculated. The device needs more power. Test run number 2, late September 1943. The team increases the rocket load. The number of rockets mounted on the rim is doubled. The brackets are adjusted to ensure they can handle the increased thermal stress. The ignition sequence is initiated. The roar is significantly louder. The smokescreen is thicker, obscuring the device from the observation post for the first few seconds. The Panjandrum bursts out of the smoke. It is moving faster now. The momentum is building. Disaster strikes at the 30-yard mark. The right wheel hits a small depression in the sand, a sand ripple caused by the receding tide. In a standard vehicle with a differential gear, the wheels can rotate at different speeds to accommodate a turn. The Panjandrum has no differential. It has no steering mechanism whatsoever. The 2 wheels are rigidly connected to the central drum. When the right wheel dips, the circumference effectively changes for a split second. The traction changes. The resistance on the right side then increases. The device yaws violently to the right. The rockets are still firing, pushing it forward, but the vector has changed. It careens off its straight path. The massive steel structure, now a projectile, heads toward the surf. The rockets on the left side, fighting against the turn, exert torque that twists the frame. The strain on the central axle is immense. The rockets burn out. The Panjandrum comes to rest in the shallow water, roughly perpendicular to its intended course. The analysis by Chute and Gudiv is immediate. The device lacks directional stability. Once a deviation begins, there is no corrective force to bring it back to center. In fact, the propulsion system exacerbates the error. If one wheel encounters more resistance, the device turns into that resistance. Engineering Modification Phase 1, October 1943. The team returns to the drawing board. They cannot add a driver. They cannot add a complex rudder system, as the speeds are too low for aerodynamic control surfaces to be effective, and the ground contact is too erratic for a ground rudder. They decide to add a third wheel. This is a non-powered trailing wheel attached to the center of the drum by a steel fork. The concept is similar to the caster on a shopping cart or the tail wheel of an airplane. The idea is that the drag of the third wheel will act as a stabilizer, keeping the axis of the main wheels perpendicular to the line of travel. The modification is welded onto the prototype. The third wheel is heavy, sturdy, and designed to bite into the sand. Test run number 3. October 1943. The modified Panjandrum sits on the beach. The third wheel trails behind the main drum. The rocket's load is increased again to compensate for the added weight and drag of the stabilizer. Ignition. The rockets fire. The wheel begins to turn. The third wheel tracks straight for the first 20 yards. The theory appears sound. Then the harmonics of the vibration begin. The burning solid fuel rockets create a tremendous amount of vibration. This energy travels through the steel rims, into the axle, and into the trailing arm of the third wheel. The third wheel begins to shimmy. The shimmy turns into a violent wobble. The stress on the mounting fork exceeds the yield strength of the steel. With a screech of tearing metal, the third wheel shears off. Freed from its stabilizer, the Panjandrum immediately reverts to its chaotic nature. It veers sharply to the left. It accelerates towards the sand dunes. The observation team scatters. The cameraman, positioned on the dunes to get a high-angle shot, realizes he is in the path of the 10-ton rolling bomb. He abandons his tripod and runs. The Panjandrum runs out of fuel just before hitting the dune line. It sits smoking in the sand, the broken stump of the third wheel assembly, pointing accusingly at the sky. The report to the Admiralty is dry. Directional stability remains unsatisfactory. Engineering Modification Phase 2, November 1943. Chute refuses to abandon the project. The pressure to find a solution for the Atlantic Wall is intensifying. Intelligence reports indicate that Rommel has been appointed to inspect and improve the coastal defences. The concrete is getting thicker. The team abandons the third wheel concept. They pivot to a cable steering system. Steel cables are attached to the ends of the central axle. These cables run back to the launch point, where they are wound around massive winch drums equipped with braking levers. The theory is rudimentary. If the Panjandrum veers to the right, the operator at the launch point pulls the brake on the left cable. This creates drag on the left side of the axle, theoretically pulling the device back to the left and correcting the course. It is steering by brute force. The cables must be strong enough to withstand tons of tension, yet flexible enough to unspool rapidly. Test run number 4, November 1943. The cables are attached. The winch operators are briefed. They are nervous. They are essentially tethered to a runaway locomotive. Ignition. The Panjandrum lurches forward. The cables unspool, screaming from the drums. The speed increases. The device begins to drift to the right. The operator on the left clamps down on the brake lever. The physics of the situation are unforgiving. The Panjandrum weighs 10 tons and is moving at roughly 50 miles per hour. The kinetic energy is massive. The brake bites. The cable goes taut. Snap. The steel cable parts under the shock load. It whips back toward the launch point like a deadly lash. Now untethered on one side, the drag from the snapped cable trailing in the sand acts as a pivot anchor. The Panjandrum pivots violently. It spins. The rockets are still firing. The centrifugal force tears several rockets loose from their brackets. These loose rockets become independent missiles. They skip across the beach, spiraling wildly. One rocket flies over the heads of the assembled VIPs. Another skims the water. The Panjandrum itself does a slow, heavy loop and topples onto its side, the remaining rockets burning a hole in the wet sand. The DMWD engineers analyze the wreckage. The cable system is a failure. The forces required to correct the course of such a massive object at speed are simply too great for a manual braking system. Engineering modification. Phase 3, January 1944. Winter has set in. The weather at Westward Ho is bleak. The DMWD team is cold, frustrated, and running out of time. They decide on a simpler, albeit more desperate solution. More rockets, more speed. The hypothesis is that if the velocity is high enough, the gyroscopic effect of the spinning wheels will provide the necessary stability. A spinning top is stable, a stationary top falls over. They need to turn the Panjandrum into a massive gyroscope. They also adjust the firing angles. Instead of all rockets firing tangentially, some are angled slightly outward to provide a measure of lateral stability. Thrust vectors that theoretically push the wheel back to center if it leans. The number of rockets is increased to over 70. The entire rim of both wheels is the solid ring of cordite tubes. The final test. January 1944. This is the dress rehearsal. The Admiralty has sent a high-ranking delegation to witness the weapon. Admirals, generals, and scientific advisors are gathered on a pebble ridge overlooking the beach. They are accompanied by a dog. The presence of the dog is noted in several diaries from the day. The Panjandrum is positioned. It looks formidable in a wall of steel and explosives. The firing sequence is initiated. The sound is deafening. 70 rockets do not just roar, they shriek. The overpressure creates a physical wave that hits the observers on the ridge. The Panjandrum accelerates. It is moving faster than ever before. The gyroscopic theory seems to be holding. It tracks straight for 50 yards, 60 yards. Then entropy asserts itself. A single rocket on the right wheel malfunctions. It fails to ignite or detaches prematurely. The thrust balance is shattered. The equilibrium is gone. The great Panjandrum begins to turn. It turns to the right. The observers on the pebble ridge realize with slow-dawning horror that they are standing to the right. The device is no longer heading for the ocean. It is heading for the VIP section. Panic ensues. The admirals, men of dignity and rank, throw themselves flat on the wet pebbles. The generals scramble for cover behind the low ridge. The dog barks furiously at the incoming steel monster. The cameraman, officially capturing the event for history, keeps filming. The footage survives. It shows the massive wheel filling the frame, smoke pouring from its rims, sparks flying as it grinds over the stones. As the Panjandrum approaches the ridge, the uneven terrain of the pebbles interacts with the rigid axle. The device hits a large stone. It bounces. 10 tons of metal becomes airborne. It lands, skew. The impact shatters the remaining rocket mounts. The wheel collapses. The central drum hits the ground and rolls. Rockets fly in every direction, exploding in the sand, fizzing in the water, and screeching overhead. The Panjandrum disintegrates in a cloud of smoke and burning cordite mere yards from the huddled form of the Admiralty delegation. Silence returns to Westward Ho, broken only by the crackle of small fires and the sound of the surf. The admirals stand up, dusting the sand from their uniforms. Neville Shute walks down from the control dune. The project is cancelled immediately. Post-mortem and legacy. The failure of the Panjandrum was absolute in terms of its stated goal. It never reached the Atlantic Wall. It never detonated a charge against a bunker. However, historical analysis suggests a secondary, perhaps unintentional utility. The Germans were aware of the testing at Westward Ho. Their reconnaissance aircraft had spotted the strange scorch marks on the beach. Their spies had reported rumours of a giant wheel. The sheer absurdity of the weapon contributed to the broader Allied deception campaign, Operation Fortitude. It reinforced the German belief that the Allies were planning an invasion across the Pas-de-Calais, where the beaches were suitable for such heavy, bizarre machinery, rather than the intricate landscape of Normandy. The DMWD moved on to other projects, the Mulberry Harbours, the Pluto Pipeline. Neville Shute returned to writing novels, eventually penning A Town Like Alice and On the Beach. But the Great Panjandrum remains the definitive symbol of the DMWD's philosophy. It was a failure, yes, but it was a magnificent, ambitious, high-velocity failure. It represented a willingness to try anything, no matter how physically improbable, to solve the engineering deadlock of the Atlantic Wall. The beach at Westward Ho is clean today. The steel scraps were salvaged long ago, but occasionally after a heavy storm a piece of rusted metal, bent and scorched, will wash up on the shingle, a fragment of the day the British Navy tried to reinvent the wheel by strapping rockets to it.